Hello. This week's Torah portion is Re'eh. In it, Moses gives the Israelites the following instructions as commanded by God. Quote, "When you encounter the idolaters, you shall tear down their altars, smash their monuments, burn their holy trees with fire, cut down the graven images of their gods, and destroy their name from that place." Unquote. Wow. Looks like God does not like idolatry one bit. The Talmud elaborates on this passage by saying that idols must not only be destroyed, but completely eradicated, that every trace of them must be removed. Elsewhere, the Talmud says that to abstain from idolatry is equivalent to fulfilling all other commandments in the Torah. So, to be a fully observant Jew, all you have to do is refrain from worshipping idols. In fact, the Talmud adds, whoever denies idols is called a Jew. If one had to sum up Judaism with one line, it would be the Shema, Hashem Echad, the Lord is one. In the Ten Commandments, even before God tells us not to steal, not to murder, not to commit adultery, even before God tells us about Shabbat and honoring our parents, God tells us, "You shall have no other God beside me, you shall not make for yourself a graven image." This comes before everything else. Moreover, Jews are allowed to break all commandments in order to save a life. All that is except three. The ones against idolatry, sexual immorality, and murder. And idolatry is listed first. Better dead than an idolater. It's fair to ask the question, why? Why is it so bad? What's so bad about idolatry that it outranks all other forms of bad behavior? After all, isn't idolatry just a matter of personal belief rather than concrete action, and Judaism places action before belief? Isn't idolatry just making statues of wood or stone and worshipping them as if they had tremendous power over you? How can that be harmful in and of itself? After all, we're not even talking about the dubious practices that came with idol worship back in biblical times. The human sacrifices, the sexual orgies, the mutilations, the trampling of human rights, the murder and stealing as accepted way of getting what you want, the treating of women as objects, the law of the jungle, etc., etc. We're talking about rejecting idolatry itself, regardless of what practices come with it. So we wonder, can't idolatry coexist with the rejections of all abominable practices? At first blush, it seems that it can. Can Judaism say no murder, no stealing, no adultery, kashrut, Shabbat, etc., but allow idolatry? In theory, it could. Buddhism is frequently advertised as a pacifist, non-violent religion with most teachings consistent with Judaism, yet it's clearly idolatrous. Hinduism has as many as 330 million gods, yet still has many teachings in common with Judaism. Gentiles have frequently charged that the God of the Jewish Bible is a jealous God, an angry God, a vengeful God, a God who does not tolerate competition. That is nonsense. Judaism takes the position that everything God enjoins us to do is ultimately for our own good. So we have to ask ourselves, where is our own good in staying away from idolatry? First, we must understand that Judaism was intended to be a completely new beginning. This is unique in the history of religion. Usually, new religions try to emphasize continuity with the old in order to gain new members more easily. For example, Christianity said, we accept everything in the Jewish Bible as holy, but God has given us his latest updates through Jesus. Islam said, Moses and Jesus were holy men and true prophets, and all that they said was true, but God has given us his latest update through Muhammad. Then the Mormons, the Baha'is, the Moonists, and many other groups said, Moses and Jesus and Muhammad were holy men and true prophets, and everything they said was true, but God has now given us his latest update through this new prophet. It's called co-option, and it works. Once you're in, of course, you notice that only lip service is paid to the religious figures of the past. You end up studying and following mostly the latest update and the prophet that came with it. But Judaism alone did not co-opt. It wanted a completely new beginning. In order to achieve that, Judaism had to make a complete break with all existing religions. And what did they all have in common? Idolatry. So idolatry had to go. So, was idolatry canned just because all others were doing it and we wanted something entirely new? No. Idolatry is intrinsically bad, but in subtle ways. Let me offer a modern perspective on why. First, by saying no graven images, God forced us into abstract thinking. This was a great leap forward. If you can't visualize, you have to use the little gray cells, and that's bound to have interesting and original results. And if history has bestowed any blessing on us Jews, originality that comes from thinking is certainly one of them. Second, by saying, I am the only God, God made us unify our thinking. God forced us into a spirit of synthesis, into accepting that two things that look very different may have the same origin. After all, it is not monotheism, but polytheism that comes naturally to the mind, as history has shown. When you see good and evil in the world, it is natural to conclude that there is a God of good and a God of evil, struggling for control. Sometimes one is ahead, sometimes the other is ahead, and that explains why there are good times and bad times. In early history, it was natural to believe there is a God for every aspect of the human experience. A God of war, a goddess of love, a God of the sea, a goddess of agriculture, etc. Lots of gods, each with its own individual territory, and no territory uncovered. What Judaism did was force us to accept that these very different things all had the same source. In the book of Isaiah, God says, quote, I am the Lord and there is no one else. There is no God beside me. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Unquote. As we internalize the notion that God is one, we synthesize, we unify, we simplify. Our minds try to see hidden connections that point to common origins, and in so doing, we help make great progress in the human adventure. As a physicist, I have obvious examples. First, matter and energy are two very different things, but Einstein, using the Jewish way of thinking, dared to say that they are really the same thing. Second, there are four fundamental forces in the universe: gravity, electromagnetism, and the two nuclear forces. Everything we see can be traced back to the action of one of these forces. Each force is responsible for a different set of observations. You might say, so that's it then, what's the problem? Can't we leave well enough alone? No. Physicists are not happy. Something inside them tells them that this picture cannot be the final one. So they try, desperately, passionately, irrationally, to unify these four forces into a single one. They call it the unified field theory, a single principle from which the four forces would logically flow, and which would describe all known observations. Einstein spent the last 30 years of his life looking for this principle. 35 years ago, 3 physicists got the Nobel Prize for unifying 2 of the 4 forces. Legions of physicists are engaged in this massive effort. And when they find this basic theory, you can be sure that something new and exciting will come out of it. It will not be just masking tape to tie the 4 forces together. What is the deep faith that moves these scientists? Hashem Echad, God is one. The ancient profession of faith of the Jew is telling them there must be ultimate unity and simplicity in the laws of nature. What seems complicated must derive from a simple principle. We must reach for higher and higher levels of understanding and find that each level has fewer building blocks than the previous one until we reach the top of the pyramid and find that it contains only one block. It does not matter that for the most part these scientists are secular and irreligious. The attitudes encouraged by religions have their influence way outside the sphere of religion. Also, with many gods, you can shop for the god that suits you best, or even manufacture one, which leads to a relative morality that allows anything you want. So there you have it. No idolatry is not an off-the-wall commandment from a selfish God. Even the most secular Jew among us owes the essence of his Jewish identity to that simple commandment, even if he does not recognize it. Now, needless to say, we Jews follow that commandment because God told us so, not because we found a good rationale. Still, it's satisfying to find good reasons. Rabbi Akiva tells us in the Talmud that it's even a mitzvah to look for these reasons. It's always good to question, even the big-ticket items, and we Jews certainly specialize in that. As we saw, idolatry was the bogeyman of the Talmud. But it is not a problem among Jews today. The Midrash tells us that Israel lost its appetite for idolatry when they returned from captivity in Babylon. But modern rabbis have found new interpretations of the word idolatry. We sometimes hear that the pursuit of material possessions is worship of wealth, that objects of sentimental value, such as items that belong to a loved one, is worship of objects, that viewing certain ideas as absolute and not subject to inquiry is worship of ideas, or idolatry of the mind, that nationalism is worship of country, that egocentrism is worship of self, that astrology is worship of the stars, that love of another human being is worship of a person, that love of pets is worship of animals, that excessive family pride is worship of ancestors, and so on. This leads one to ask the question, are we going overboard here? Is anything that you care one whit about idolatry? I'll leave this question open for now. But as we question left and right, we must have faith in one simple thing. Whatever our tradition tells us to do is ultimately for our own good. For Judaism to survive, we must continue to have that simple faith. Shabbat Shalom.